Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Iconocast here with the Southeastern Louisiana University English Department's graduate colloquium. Today, our guest is a critic, a translator, and we encountered her work with Maryse Conde's The Belle Creole this past semester. And our, what is it? Just women's Caribbean writing as a whole right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
women and Caribbean literature.
Caribbean literature. And there was a lot of profound questions that we came upon reviewing her work and this translation. And we thought it great to invite her. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Miss Nicole Simek. How are you doing, Nicole?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah.
Great. How's the weather in Washington for everybody?
We're hanging in there. it's,
Yeah.
it's getting a little bit warmer.
All right. Well,
Mhm.
today, me and Kendall, we just have a few questions. We'll talk through it. No rush, taking our time. I saw you had a cup of, is it coffee or water? We have a cup
Just water for
of water.
now.
Same for us. We don't want to get too excited. So the first question, Nicole, is what led you to personally explore French Caribbean literature and the philosophies and theories of those peoples?
Yeah, well, partly chance. I think I started reading literature in French, more generally in francophone literatures, when I was an undergrad in college, kind of early in my undergrad experience. And I had always been fascinated with language. And at that point in my life, I was also really fascinated with questions of social norms and power. And when I started reading French literature and francophone literature, it was right at that moment where I was just starting to develop, I think, a vocabulary for thinking about gender, for thinking about race and questions of power. So that kind of being able to articulate what was bothering me about social norms that I hadn't been able to put a finger on as a younger person, that kind of coincided with reading French literature and francophone literature. And so that really pulled me in, I think, as an interest. So these literatures, particularly Caribbean literature, which is so deeply focused on language as both as a medium of political control, but also as this enormous source of creativity,
Yeah.
resistance, ways of thinking. So that really pulled me in, and I had an opportunity to take some classes as a student in different areas of francophone literature, and one on Maryse Conde and Ousmane Sembène in particular, a comparative class that got me really
Mhm.
hooked, and that was the beginning and the end of my story. I think I've stuck with it ever since.
Oh, wow. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
Well, that is really awesome. So that actually kind of leads us to our next question. Since you did bring up language and the study of language, do you find that there is a distinct giveaway in someone's language that shows that they are French Caribbean outside of using Creole?
um, I don't know if there's a distinct giveaway. I think there are some shared phrases and cadences, but I don't know that I could put my finger on something very rigid, like a category.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Does that
I
apply to writing as well? Do you think that French Caribbean writers, they have a, like you were saying, do they use idioms or rhythms or the way they speak? Because we ask that because as
Mhm.
mhm.
when we when we see Southern literature or Irish literature, some people believe that you can see their their regionalism before
There's
you
a
even see the
tell.
themes or the
Yeah.
settings. Yeah, is there
Yeah,
a tell
yeah.
for that?
Um, I don't think so. I don't think, well, I would say, I guess, when I think about Caribbean literature and different authors, I think kind of like a metaphor that comes to mind is that of a constellation. So you can
Uh,
kind of see a
Mhm.
pattern or a unit and affinities between the different stars that make up that constellation. You could say, yeah, I recognize that is Caribbean literature. But when you get up closer, you start to see the individuality of each star, and then like the distances or differences between them, and vice versa. When you move away, you start seeing affinities
Mhm.
between this constellation and others, and the kind of contours of it may fade or become
Mhm. Yeah,
less,
that
yeah,
is a
rigid.
beautiful way to describe it,
yeah, great
actually. It
analogy.
provides such a vivid idea of what you're talking
Yeah.
about. That was great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said because I know that Confiant will say, and a lot of the Creolite movement, that language is the, I'll say it bears most of the culture.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess everything that we've researched, it implies they're talking about the preservation of the Creole language. But I didn't know, we haven't known if the way they engage French, which would be the mother language or partially a parent language, if it would be different. But you're saying that maybe not so much, no?
Well, I think yes and no. I think
Okay.
it's hard. I think you can see kind of patterns or affinities and cadences, like I said, and particular use of terms or structures that are modeled on Creole grammar. But it's hard to draw a line, I guess, between, this is French Caribbean and this is not. And then thinking about who belongs to that, who gets to claim affinity with the French Caribbean, what happens to people in diaspora or second generation Caribbeans or Antillians who are born in France, for example, or in London in the British context of, their parents have moved away from the islands themselves, but they still feel kind of an identification with the culture and with ways of speaking, ways of thinking the world, seeing the world through the language. So
Yeah. Well, going off of that, I mean, there are plenty of French Caribbean writers or Antillean writers, as we'll be more specific. And like you said, you did that comparative class, and a lot of the journal publications you've had, you certainly don't just concentrate on her, but there does seem to be you do seem to gravitate toward Conde a little bit more. Can you tell us why Conde is such a big figure for you?
Yeah, I do have a little bit of an obsession with Conde. I do find myself coming back to her work. I think in part it's because I tend to read that way generally. I really love rereading. So I know some people don't like to reread. They like the freshness of newness of new authors, and I certainly enjoy that too. But I do tend to, I really love to reread and linger over kind of phrases and narrative structures and re-experiencing and thinking about how something comes together. So I think that's my general tendency. But I really love with Conde, I really love her range, the different topics that she takes on and how her inventiveness. She's constantly trying out new structures, taking on new contemporary issues. At the same time, she does have a distinctive voice, and I think it's maybe because I've been reading her for so long. I do, thinking about your earlier question, I do continue to hear Conde's voice when I pick up one of her books, and part of that voice, I think, is her really ironic wit. So there's kind of a dry, biting humor, and that has always really appealed to me. I think, and I think what I like about it too is that, I mean, it's impossible to take everything in her work seriously. There's always a kind of ironic humor that is daring you to not to read too much into what she's saying or to take a clear lesson away from it. But at the same time, it's impossible not to just write what she's saying off as fun, as just jest. There's a seriousness in her playfulness and a playfulness in her seriousness that I think really keeps me engaged and keeps that kind of interpretive hunger, to use a metaphor that I talk about a lot, going. So yeah.
No, it's good to hear that, because us reading her, she's challenging, because it's like just you don't know where you're being taken when you're. It's very unpredictable, and it's analogous to some things we read. And there's a little, when we read her, the region she speaks of in Louisiana, there's an analogy there as well, in the culture and the history, the way peoples were treated. But it's good to hear that, because we were wondering, is it just because she lies in such juxtaposition to the rest of French Caribbean literature? She's very unique, and even sometimes there's conflict, and she kind of embraces the conflict. But that's really cool to hear that it resonates with you some other way. Cool.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to actually your translation work. Specifically, what made us kind of aware of you was reading the Belle Creole, obviously, and your translation work with that. So to start off with that, what circumstances led you to translate La Belle Creole? Because obviously Maryse Conde is very selective about
Mhm.
her
Her
translators.
translator.
Yeah. So what led you to translate that?
Yeah, well, I'd always been drawn to this novel came out when I was in grad school, I think. So I read it when it first came out, and I was really taken with it. Fascinated by how it resonated and also departed from her earlier book, Crossing the Mangrove, which you might be familiar with. So it reworks this narrative framework of a 24-hour period in which the story unfolds. And it also features many different voices. So I got fascinated by the book really early on. I got my job here at Whitman College, and I teach courses in French most of the time, a lot of the time. So I taught the novel in French a few times, but I also have the opportunity to teach in English in the Race and Ethnic Studies program and the Gender Studies program. So I started to wonder when the English version would come out so that I could use it in my classes in particular, because I think that the themes really, even though the book is now 20 years old, it still feels very contemporary, and it's the themes that she takes up there still resonate and still have that ability to prompt kind of conversation. So it happened, I think it was in fall of 2017. I was on sabbatical. I was coming off of a stint as like a faculty governance administrative kind of period in my work. So I was really hungering for some creative outlets. And it occurred to me that I should contact Maryse and Richard and ask if he had any plans to translate the book. And it happened that he didn't. It had been sitting untranslated. So I said I would be interested in doing it if that would be okay with them. And they were supportive of the idea of seeing if I could find an editor and kind of bringing it to English. So I got very excited and and then just jumped into the project from there.
Wow, well, that is awesome, because we did read your interview with her, and we did see the part where she talked about translators and her
Yes.
opinions on them. So we just wanted to see like what
It's a
kind
very
of led
high
that.
bar. So
Yes,
I can only hope I've done it justice.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course. So next we were wondering, how was your experience translating her work? What were some obstacles that you faced, or some parts that you really appreciated that maybe you didn't expect to appreciate?
Mhm. Um, I think, first I'll just say I really love the work. It was incredibly engaging, I think, to the point where the time would pass, I would forget to eat. I would be so absorbed in the work. Um, So I think some of the challenges. So this was my first time taking on a really large literary translation project. So I think in my eagerness and being newer to that kind of work, I think I made some inevitable kind of trial and error mistakes along the way. I think linked to that, the main obstacle was getting distance on what I was producing. I think because I had written on this text before in my work as a critic. I was, on the one hand, intimately familiar with it, but you need a different kind of familiarity with the work when you're working as a translator, looking at sentence level structure, but also how that sentence level structure relates to the bigger picture. So finding time to put the translation aside, let it rest, and get some critical distance on it, I found that to be the hardest part of the process, actually. So I was really fortunate to have really helpful colleagues and my partner and even family members who were willing to read some drafts and give their perspective from different readers who are in very different positions, who have different levels of familiarity with Condé. So that was helpful too, getting other eyes on the process.
Yeah, cool. That leads us nicely to this question that we had discussed. In his preface to Crossing the Mangrove, Phil Cox, he talks about that voice, which, first of all, to our viewers who are only Anglophone, which is probably all of them, her translation of the Belle Creole just released in this past June, correct? So, or was it? Am I wrong?
Let's see. The time all blurs together.
Like
I think it was April, May. Yeah, spring.
April, May. Yeah. The 2020 was. Did it exist? Did we not just skip a year?
Exactly.
But yeah, so we're like in a way this first year, first wave to be, engaging that text
Mhm.
in English. And it's fascinating to us as we read it, how poetic at points it is, which
Mhm.
must be challenging across language. But back to Philcox, to the people that do not know, Mr. Richard Philcox is Maryse Conde's husband, and he has translated, you would say, probably most of her popular works for
Mhm.
certain to English. So if you're an Anglophone who has engaged Miss Conde's work, it's been through the conduit of Richard Philcox.
Yeah.
So the question to you is, as he said, he really used Virginia Woolf's voice. And we know that from your interviews with her that Conde is a big fan of Woolf. So our question to you is, did you use a similar guide to render that? And what Phil Cox calls the sound and conviction of Conde. What was your
Mhm.
guide for translating?
Yeah. I didn't use a single author text like he did, but I had read his work previously. So I had read and taught his translation of Crossing the Mangrove, of Haramakinon, Maryse Conde's first novel, and also Story of the Cannibal Woman. So I think I had done a lot of that work before I knew I would be taking on this translation project. So I think those examples of his previous kind of renderings of her voice inevitably
Yeah.
worked their way into my thinking. It's hard in hindsight to pull out the different influences. And I was thinking a lot about what he said about Virginia Woolf and the kind of rhythm of Conde's sentences when I was working on the Belle Creole, because I think another one of the challenges with her voice is the rhythm and the length. She writes very long sentences, and in this particular case, it's set up as a kind of murder mystery, even though some of the elements no, I won't give any spoilers here, but some of the elements are really clear what has happened at the beginning of the novel. But I found that a lot of the sentences were kind of structured in the same way. So important information would come at the end of the sentence. And that syntax isn't always, you can't always be directly reproduced in English. So thinking about ways to maintain the effect of the kind of building of suspense as you're waiting to find out what happens
Right.
and the level of the sentence. That was a really fascinating challenge and interesting for me to think about as I was working. So it was, I guess I was thinking of it from both from a question of rhythm and how the reader would be experiencing this in English, just the sound and the pacing, but also from a kind of an epistemological angle too. Is like, how is the knowledge of what's unfolding being, how is that linked to the sentence structure itself? So
Yeah, the sentence length and the way that images are given, it reminded me of Faulkner or George Washington Cable, where it's like, I mean, I promised Kendall that I wasn't going to read from the book, because there's this the description of the main character as a comma on the waves. That
yes, that's
it's
one of
like
my favorite
it's a
images.
great, but that sentence is like half a page long. It's brilliant. It's brilliant, that writing, but to think how you translated that, I am monolingual. Or, we can order at a restaurant.
Yes.
Are you monolingual
Yes,
too?
I'm also
To
monolingual.
see how you're juggling that on a artistic level,
yeah.
We need to dig deeper for certain, but
Right.
Yeah, and just I think too in this the narrative voice slips in and out of other characters' voices so often, and that was another kind of challenge, and also a pleasure working on thinking about, so the narrative perspective is the narrator is kind of taking on this other character's kind of viewpoint and the way they speak and the register that they use. So there's all sorts of mixes of register and Conde in the French. It moves in and out of kind of a standard French or regional Guadeloupean French and Creole, different forms of Creole, even Creole that's been transliterated into French spelling and Creole that's in Creole spelling. So trying to reproduce those kinds of nuanced distinctions was a challenge, but also a fun challenge to think, how would this sound in English? How do you capture that voice?
Yeah, exactly. And that actually did kind of answer the next question that we had prepared, which was essentially what do you prioritize when translating? Because we know, and we have taken many courses on translating, or at least talking about the effects of translating on a text, and how it can be very difficult to juggle like preserving the author's narrative voice while also making it fit for the culture that you're writing towards and you're aiming
Yeah,
your work
yeah,
towards. And
yeah.
I think you answered that question already, basically, on like trying to get all of that to weave together, which
Yeah.
sounds
Well,
very
and
difficult.
I think thinking about, I mean, Conde's, even her English speaking audience is really diverse. So thinking about how the English will resonate with and so Caribbean Englishes, American Englishes, British Englishes, which the question of which English is always um, uh, it's difficult to navigate, let's say. So
Right.
Yeah. Well, real quick, we have a student submitted a
Mhm.
question. We try to
Mhm.
field them as they go.
Yeah.
We don't
Sure.
want them to get impatient with us doing all the talking, So uh this is from Sarah. Sarah wanted to know what writer or book would you suggest to someone as a starting point uh interested in exploring French Caribbean literature?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you. It's hard to pick just one. I think one that comes to mind, though, is Patrick Chamoiseau's Solibo Magnificent. The English translation of that is, so the French is called Solibo Magnifique, and the English translation is Solibo Magnificent. And the English translation is fabulous. So Rose Miriam Réjoui and Val Vinokourov have done a really amazing kind of rendering of that book. So I think, I mean, that book is a book about language, and it's about, what does it mean to be Martinican or French Caribbean, and what has that meant over time. So I think that that book is a really good kind of first glimpse, and it's fun and it's challenging in a fun way too. So I like to recommend that one, and I like to recommend reading that one alongside Maryse Conde's Crossing the Mangrove. Actually, they came out around the same time in the late 80s, and there are some really fascinating affinities, but also they're really different books in terms of their style and voice. But so kind of reading those in tandem gives you kind of, I would say, two entry points. That way you're getting a glimpse of the diversity or just even a little glimpse of the diversity of French Caribbean writing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that answer. So our next question for you is, did you find that your role as a critic intersected with your role as a translator? And if so, where? And if not, just
Mhm.
expand upon the separation that you went through.
Yeah. Um, I think where it mostly impacted my work was thinking about Conde's audience as being made up of both critics, but also readers who aren't necessarily literary critics, or they're not trained in literary criticism. Because I think the different publics come to her work with different needs and different expectations based on their previous familiarity with her work. So as a critic, I found myself wanting to stay very close to the original. I think I mentioned the syntax before, and especially in the beginning when I was doing some early drafts, I found myself wanting to stick to be able to maintain the structures and the vocabulary of the original for an audience that might be working in both languages, or who takes a literary historical or literary critical interest in how that original is constructed. But a translator has to think too about readability, and more generally, what kinds of transpositions or modifications are actually needed to capture the spirit or the thrust of a work. Sometimes sticking too close to the original doesn't actually do that. It doesn't create the same effect.
Mhm.
So I think that thinking about those questions, that's where I would see myself kind of putting on a different hat and changing perspective compared to where I normally sit as a literary critic.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, we're gonna dig a little into that criticism now,
Mhm.
which we'll try to help us keep it light because we have deep
Sure.
questions, but our
Yeah.
audience, they're not all reading it. So we'll try to give it to them, the the appetizer, not the main
Mhm.
dish. Like we were talking about this conflict that is Conde with
Mhm.
the other writers from her area in her
Mhm.
language and academia. Um, can you explain to us if there is, because the way we interpret it is
Mhm.
she does kind of she does not neatly fit into French Caribbean literature or literary post-colonialism in the most popular views of either. Can you explain to us where she does align or doesn't align within those ideas, in your opinion?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned conflict, and maybe we could start there and kind of give some more details about the kinds of debates that she participates in or that others put her in. So I think maybe one you're referring to are the Creolist authors,
Yeah.
Mhm.
with Confiant, and so Raphael Confiant and Patrick Chamoiseau. Um, so I think especially early on when the Creolist writers were putting out their manifestos and kind of taking a position on Creole, they were coming to the question from the perspective of having been Creole speakers. That was their native language. That's what they spoke at home. And it was a language that was always repressed. You weren't allowed to speak it at school. You were punished for speaking it at school. It wasn't valued generally in France. It was viewed kind of as an inferior dialect that needed to be kind of done away with. So whereas Creole, in fact, is a language with a rich history, it's complex, it's capable of doing much more, and it is people's native language. It's what's close to their heart, it's what they speak. And so the Creolists took a pretty militant position on revaluing Creole and building it back up, doing the work to expand a language, to give it back its dignity. And I think Conde, I mean, she did not, her family didn't speak Creole at home. They were raised more in that more dominant French. Not, I mean, she doesn't espouse that ideology anymore, but her family, she was raised to learn to speak French. She could understand a little bit of Creole, but French is her native language, and French is the main language that she works with, although she also works a little bit with Creole too. So where her concern came in was the idea that you must speak in Creole in order to be an authentic French Caribbean. So I think these debates get very personal about what's the best way to give value back to a language. At what point does that become a kind of a dictate, a mandate that you must speak Creole or you're not really Martinican or you're not really Guadeloupean, or you're participating in the dominant culture and in the suppression of Creole.
Mhm.
So those language debates get very heated because there's a lot at stake. Um, so I think, I mean, that was one source of conflict, is what language should a writer write in? And Conde
Mhm.
has always held the position that a writer should not be forced to write in a particular language. That, and in any case, she's very famous for saying, you know, I don't write in French, I don't write in Creole, I write in Maryse Conde. So every writer changes
Yeah.
the language, they reinvent it. So you don't just reproduce kind of an existing structure. You're working with it, you're recreating as you speak, and that's part of the goal of writing. And I think that I mean, her trajectory too, she had left Guadeloupe when she was 16 to finish her studies in France and spent a long time in West Africa after she with her first marriage. Her children were born in Africa. And so she spent a lot of time living elsewhere, moving around the globe, and thinking about some of the problems that come with kind of rigid notions of identity or nationalism. So her perspective is someone who's been an outsider in many different places and has navigated those different cultures. So she's always been very wary of trying to put borders around an identity or claim a rigid notion of authenticity that leaves others out. And so the Creolists, though, from their perspective, is, you know, we're the people who are at home, who aren't nomads, who aren't moving around. what does their identity mean to them, and how do you maintain that dignity and that creativity when there still is a power dynamic that can't just be ignored, where French is still the dominant language. It's the language of schooling for the most part. So how do you navigate that at the same time?
Mhm.
So that's where my first thoughts go. I think
Yeah.
other kinds of categories that she's tried to resist is the notion that a writer should give lessons. And I think when she talks about the term post-colonial or French Caribbean, oftentimes the expectation is that a post-colonial writer is going to be giving you a political message and a lesson that you can come away with in order to bring about some political program. And she's always been very suspicious of using literature to give kind of single clear lessons. She much prefers kind of raising questions, stirring the pot, creating ambiguity. So
Yes,
yeah.
Of course.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, that that was deep, but I think
Yeah.
I hope I
got
didn't
it.
go on too long.
Very informative.
No,
though.
that's the same. I think that was
No,
perfect.
very
I think that
good.
was perfect.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah. So we're actually going to go just a little bit more into Maryse Conde and her feelings on Creole. Even though you did already touch on the fact that there is a lot of discourse, of course, surrounding Creole and its usage. Obviously we are from Louisiana, and we do
Mhm.
have, a population that does speak Creole. And a lot of us are Cajun, so we do have that kind of influence around us.
Yeah.
I know Tyler and I are both born and raised here, so we do understand. But kind of our question is, how do you see the conceptualization of Creole as a language, as people, as theory being treated in Conde's work and the works of her contemporaries? Because of course, to us Louisianians, we do have some sort of concept of Creole ourselves, but
Mhm.
can you also explain how the Caribbean idea of Creole may be different or similar to our idea of Creole?
Yeah. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but I would also love to hear
Mhm.
more about like what Creole means in Louisiana from your perspective too. So I think, I mean, Conde in many of her works, I mean, she will incorporate the language and we see this in the Belle Creole, for example. So, I mean, she sees it as part of reality that needs to be acknowledged. It's part of the cultural landscape. It's part of people's horizons. It's the language that they use. So she wants to account for that, I think, in her writing about the Caribbean. Um, I think to go back to these previous debates, I think Edouard Glissant's notion of creolization is helpful here. So thinking about what does Creole mean, or what does Creoleness mean? Is Creoleness a thing, créolité, as some of these Creolist writers would say in their early writings? Is créolité an identity, Creoleness an identity that you can define, that has certain characteristics that you can put a finger on? To get back to some of our, it's reminding me of some of the earlier discussion we were having about French Caribbeanness, right?
Mhm.
So is it an identity, a cultural identity, or is Creoleness, is Creolization what is important, which is kind of a process of mixing and an
Mhm.
openness to kind of multiple cultural influences? So is Creolization kind of a state of mind, an attitude towards mixing, a way of life, or is it linked to like particular foods, particular words,
Mhm.
a particular identity? So I think that's on the conceptual level. I think that's I would see Conde, I mean, wanting to account for how people understand their identity, but also I think she leans more towards the notion of creolization as something to to celebrate a kind of openness to mixing and inventiveness. But in terms of Louisiana, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts, because I think too, what Creole means depends on, who are the others in your constellation that you're
Mhm.
kind of that are influencing your definition, because these definitions always happen in relation, right? So if
Right.
Creole in Martinique and Guadeloupe, you have France and the the state
Mhm.
of France and the long history of the French language being put on a pillar as the language of expression and thought and philosophy, right?
Right.
Whereas Louisiana, I mean, you have a history of a relationship to French colonization, but also the
Right.
U.S., right?
Of course, yeah. So for us, I know in particular, my family, like I said, is Cajun. My grandma grew up speaking Cajun French. Unfortunately, I never got to learn from her because it was seen as something bad. So in schools, they kind of stopped allowing them to speak Cajun French, just as you mentioned earlier, they would do in other areas. And I know that there is a lot of conflation between the ideas of Cajun and Creole here. You know, people tend to hear one and think of the other. There isn't much separation there. Tyler, do you have any thoughts on it?
I know that for me, it was until engaging the Creolist, which made me think of a concept of hybridity in general. It was always language. Even, the Haitian, there are a lot of Haitians in New Orleans, and they speak a Creole. And then there's even English Creole. I've in Belize, places like that. So it was language, but I know with Confiant, you were saying, I know he'll talk about the importance of language, because when she was saying it, I thought, Creole cooking.
Yeah.
That's like a big deal down. Like,
yes,
we
major.
don't even think about it, but that is so. It's challenging because Louisiana is it's diverse in a way. There is New Orleans, but there are rural areas that are very different. But New Orleans itself is very diverse. So I before engaging these people, I would have thought that the Creole of Louisiana would have been a completely different thing. Just like George Washington Cable, like I brought up old Creole days. There's an implication that he might even be alluding to the Creole as hybridity as a concept, like of just like you're saying, when you say Creolization, you're talking about just a mixture, correct? It's not like a specific mixture of any things. It's just mixture,
Right.
correct?
Yeah. I mean, some of in Glissant's work and in some of the Creolists too, you get the sense that I'm forgetting the exact line, but Creolization is kind of viewed as like where the world in general is heading, right? The world is moving in towards Creolization. Like borders get broken down and cultures get mixed up. That's not to say that there's no stability, though. I think we can think of it as a both and, that there is still an identity in maybe not in a rigid sense, like it's a fixed identity that never changes, but we do have, I mean, we have the foods that we gravitate to, and ways of speaking and ways of seeing the world. Those things there is a bit of stability there, even as Creolization is happening over time.
Yeah. So, I mean, in your opinion, I know, so Creole should no longer, and I guess I'll even take a step further. I guess we would have identified Creole as a mixture between a white and a black person, like either specifically of somebody with French ancestry and black ancestry. That in Louisiana, we were talking about it just before you. One of our classmates was saying that's how they identify. I saw a person as a Creole, regardless if they was French ancestry or anything. Down here, it's. I would say it's racial. That the term Creole is probably racial. Do you agree? You think?
Yeah, I would say it's racial, because although Cajun and Creole do have some sort of like mixing happening, I definitely do see people who have maybe more of a French ancestry identifying with Cajun, whereas people with more black ancestry do identify with Creole more. But there is still that conflation of culture where we both still have the same foods and some of the same dialects, even to an extent.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating comparison, because with Martinique and Guadeloupe, because the history of the word Creole there, I mean, originally Creole referred to white settlers who were born in the colonies. So it only applied to whites in the beginning. So as a distinction from whites born in the colonial center. So it's only more recently, from like mid 20th century and the work of the Creolists, that aside from the language has always been called Creole too, which was spoken by everyone on the plantation. slaves, workers, but also the plantation owners, the slave owners spoke Creole during that period. So the language became associated with the term, but it's only more recently that Creole has come to be associated with a culture more generally, and it's other kind of racial categorizations or color terms still persist alongside the idea of Creole as a language and a culture. So,
do you see that as a conflict with some of the sectarianism that we see in academia, or like a post-colonial thought? Do you think creolization is in conflict or in tension with that?
with kind of like trying to maintain turf or
Yes.
categories.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, it's interesting to think about institutionalization and what we study under what banners too. So we use categories like post-colonial or French Caribbean to kind of organize our constellations, to go back to that metaphor, and to organize that our thoughts about an area. But if we were to push the creolization model, we would want to pair works that we might not put together, and read things alongside one another, or engage with different forms of cultural production alongside one another that may have certain things in common, but that connection might not be obvious to us if we stick to just the categories as our organizing principle. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for following us down that rabbit hole, because we're very uncertain. That feels kind of like free falling, because it's hard to conceptualize some of those things that have a cultural meaning to us that is probably incorrect, especially in contrast to what we see from the Antillean writers, who have a brilliant perspective on it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
You got the next one?
Yeah, I'll take the next one. So as we were reading your French Caribbean criticism, obviously we came across the theme of of cannibalism, of course.
Yeah.
So, of eating, hunger, and cannibalism.
Yeah.
So rooted in much of French Caribbean literature, you see that. And criticism pioneered by Suzanne César especially talks on this.
Yeah.
So for our viewers who are unaware of what those concepts entail, would you define and expand on what this idea of cannibalism in French Caribbean literature is?
Sure. And I think to get to Suzanne César's work, thinking a little bit about the historical context before her essay when she was working in the 30s and 40s. So hunger, I think, like you said, the feeling of hunger and the fear of starvation haunt, I think, popular memory, but also literature in the French Caribbean. So if looking at folk tales, for example, trying to find food, trying to use your wits to stay fed is a constant theme, or getting punished for eating more than you should. In the folk tales, we see these remembrances of slavery and of colonization too, because even after the days of slavery, people were constantly hungry. So just the theme of hungry, just being hungry, hunger, it kind of haunts cultural memory, and it's present as a theme. So beyond the experience of hunger from the point of view of the hungry, there's also kind of a political and economic structure of the colonizer feeding off of the colonies. So in a literal sense, since the colonies were producing sugar, rum, and kind of food products, we see that the colonies themselves producing food for the colonizer, for the colonial center. And by extension, the people who are made to labor to do that producing are kind of being consumed. So their bodies are being used up, they're being eaten up in the process of cultivating the land for the colonizer. And then in a more modern period, we see kind of this moving into a metaphorical realm, the Caribbean, the tropics as a kind of exotic location, a spicy, sugary kind of enticement. So the Caribbean becomes the paradise that you escape to. That's your spice in life, right? If you're from the north and cloudy and cold, it's where you go to reconnect with nature and with everything that makes it fun to be alive. So this stereotype persists. So Suzanne Césaire, working in she's from Martinique, and Martinique was still a colony at the time that she was writing. So, and not just Suzanne Césaire, but also the Brazilian writers working on this kind of literary cannibalism movement. It's a way of kind of flipping that power dynamic and saying, we're not just going to produce things for you, imitate you, absorb the models that you give us. We're going to digest them, make them our own, and turn them against you, the colonizer, in a certain sense. So literary cannibalism is about taking what these models of being, of relating, of your own identity, and digesting them, taking them apart, making them your own, and making them something new. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Conde is, I mean, from our examples of reading her, she does that. She'll take stuff from the Western canon and rewrite it. And it's funny, in the interview y'all had with her in 2003, I'll show the book to everybody in a bit, but she talks about when she's writing, she'll forget to eat and drink sometimes.
Yeah.
And I thought that went brilliantly with that.
It's ironic, right?
It's like she's eating something else while she's writing, which is
kind of mental nourishment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have a question from someone. This is from Alec. He wants to know, have you ever visited the French Caribbean islands? And if you have, what has your experience been there, especially in relation to the literature?
Yeah, I've spent, I haven't had the chance to spend extended stay there, but I've been to Martinique and Guadeloupe a few times. So I've done some work like visiting kind of cultural sites. There's a relatively new museum dedicated to slavery, the memory of slavery in Guadeloupe, that was started just almost around the same time that the Smithsonian Museum on African American History and Culture was inaugurated in Washington. So so when I've gone, I've been interested in exploring cultural sites in getting a sense. I mean, a lot of Caribbean writers talk about the landscape as being kind of a testament to memory. So Derek Walcott has made this comment, but Edouard Glissant too, about how do you go about uncovering your history when much of it has been erased or suppressed, and even like the physical remnants of buildings have often been overtaken by vegetation. So so when I visited, I've had that kind of goal in mind of getting to know how people live, what is their experience of the space, how is tourism functioning too, and seeing how the economic structures are set up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's been a privilege to be able to travel to get a sense of the space and see kind of directly what writers are engaging with when they're talking about space and the land and their relationship to it.
Yeah. Part of me wanted to respond, doesn't sound like a bad extended stay. But
no, of course.
Isn't that a part of our, you were saying that idealization that we have of this Caribbean islands in the States, probably around the world, but definitely in the States,
Yeah, it's kind of inescapable. We all have we come with our histories and our own desires, and we can't escape that. So, which is reminding me of Jacques Derrida's metaphor that I use a lot in my work, the notion of eating well. So if we think about, if we're a consumer, we have to eat, as Derrida says. So the question isn't it, do we eat or do we not eat, but how do we eat well? So what kind of relationship are we establishing within the constraints that we we all live in when we're visiting a place. What kind of responsibilities do we have as
Yeah.
people who are not local? How do you engage respectfully with a location, right?
Yeah, that goes with
Mhm.
that. We read that article in which you gave that prose poetry
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
dichotomy with
Yeah.
what is being ate, what is being eaten, I should say. Look at my English. It's
Mm.
Louisiana. There you go. That's Louisiana. But anyway, that dichotomy of what is being consumed is not
Mhm.
just food, even though that is important, physical, but yeah, I mean that
Yeah.
is it spiritual, intellectual, emotional. It goes on a
Yeah.
wide array there. Yeah.
And that manifesto really deals with kind of consumer culture and the way the economy has been skewed towards kind of services and consumption in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And that is true too when you visit. I mean, you can see that directly. You can see what's on where the products coming from that are available in the grocery stores. What kinds of stores are available? How's the land being used or not used to produce new things? So yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as we've brought up many times, we read your interview with Maryse Conde, and
Mhm.
there was one answer in particular that she had that we wanted to ask you a little bit about. So in that interview, you and your colleagues asked her about the terms francophone, Antillean, post-colonial, and woman writer, and her response was that one needs these labels in order to get into literature departments. So essentially, Conde does not really care for these cultural labels, maybe as much as others do, and instead only uses them to really enter into academia. So regarding this literary canon, do you feel like Conde's ideas are true? Are the labels themselves of importance? Are they mostly important when speaking about academia?
Mhm. Well, I think the labels do have the function that she's citing, that it's
Mm,
in order to be legible, sometimes we have to work through these labels in order to have a conversation with the academy. It's one
mm,
way of entering into a conversation. I would say that these categories, they have value to the extent that they reflect, I'm thinking of the US, so the term post-colonial or women's studies,
mm,
they do have value to the extent that it reflects a deliberate kind of decision on the part of departments to try to decolonize their programs or to democratize
Mhm.
what's considered valuable in the academy. So that it does have that history that wasn't always the case that post-colonial would get you in the door, right? That so seeing post-colonial literature as something that is valuable, that is worth our time, that needs to be studied, a label can have that kind of practical value because
mm,
it helps put a name on something that maybe hasn't been visible or hasn't been named before. Um, so to the extent that they can be used as a kind of shorthand for a more fluid and complex reality, then they can have a positive impact. But of course, if they become just rigid categories, or if they become ways of separating, of compartmentalizing. It's like, oh, post-colonial stuff happens over here. We don't have to deal with it outside of that, right? Then it's less useful. Then it stops having a purpose. And and I mean, the question of legibility cuts both ways. You know, who's doing the reading, whose terms are who's setting the kind of terms of the debate by which you get recognized as an interlocutor, as somebody that you should be dialoguing with, right?
Yeah, no, that was a question that she and I had discussed a while because
mm,
it's like
Hmm.
um in English departments in general, you have to learn the Western canon. There's extreme value in that. I mean,
mhm,
but at the
Hmm.
same time, some schools they seem to be way that way, and then the other one, those that are non-Western canon, or kind of bottlenecked and but allowed to be validated through those those terms.
Hmm.
But like I was telling you, like we were discussing earlier, Conde has this. There's a brilliance there that I'll go and say it. I'll probably get beat on my way to the car. I would put on par with William Faulkner. I really would.
Mhm.
And there's an analogy there as far as the way they write, but what they're writing about. But in Louisiana or the South, Conde won't be put on that pedestal of Faulkner, you
Mm,
know, maybe
mhm.
rightfully to some folks, but it's just interesting that Conde kind of is aware of that academic shape, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
that raises the question of why works get put in a canon in the first place,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Presumably because they have something valuable to say. They're complex, right? I'm thinking, Teju Cole gave a talk at Whitman last week, and he said something that really struck me that, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I value works in the canon, but I don't venerate them. I don't worship them. So recognizing that something has value is very different from putting it on a pedestal, right? And not letting
Right.
anyone else up on the pedestal with it. So it can be helpful to go back to, why are we reading these things in the first place? What is that value? What kinds of questions are they raising? And then that allows us to bring other people into the conversation, right?
Right.
If
Mhm.
we can remember what the questions were that 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 made us value something in the first place.
Yeah. And we appreciate you taking that question because our department is wonderful. You know, I mean,
Mm.
we engage your work through our department,
Mhm.
but we know that there's that, that cloud looming over the academia of the United States, Western academia in general.
Yeah.
We wanted to get following that Conde path. We wanted to see what you thought. So thank you.
Mhm.
Um, Going back to you though, as a translator and a critic, um, what is lost in reading Conde in English, in your opinion?
Mhm.
Is
Mm.
anything gained?
Um, well, I do think it's better to read in translation than not, because you're still you're engaging, you're having a conversation,
Right.
but you're having that conversation through a filter. So I think I was thinking about cooking as a kind of metaphor for this too. So when people move to a new country, a new region, they can't find the ingredients that they used to use, they'll substitute something else.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
comes out of that is it can be very different. It can be very good. It can taste great. It's
Mhm.
not exactly the same. So something can be gained and something can be lost at the same time. So there
Yeah.
can be a kind of both and. So it is kind of you're having a conversation with somebody you might not have been able to talk to before, but you're having that conversation through a filter, and you may end up in a very different place if you're having that conversation in one language than you would have if you were in engaging with the original. But we can't learn all languages. Some of us can learn more than others, but it takes a long time. So I think Conde herself has described translation as a kind of necessary evil, and that it's
Yeah.
you can't get around it. And I do think there are gains to it. Um, the loss is I would think of loss is more in terms of kind of a general power dynamic too. Who gets
Mhm.
translated, who doesn't, what languages get translated. So
Mhm.
how many French texts get translated into English versus American literature that gets translated into other languages. Yeah. So what I think here too, the question of canon and value, the more powerful are going to be translated into other people's languages, and
Yeah.
the less powerful or less likely to have their voices translated and brought into that conversation. So when I think about gains and losses, I think of it on that kind of structural level too. What is the business of translation and the power dynamics of translation?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I don't. This might in the Belle Creole, the Creole words and a glossary in the back. Was
Mhm.
that your decision or was that an editor's decision?
That was a kind of a conversation with the editors.
Okay.
Yeah, I initially was kind of interested in not have there isn't a glossary in the original, so I was interested
Uh,
in just letting the words sit and having readers kind of puzzle over them, because I think a lot of
Mhm.
the words are you can kind of puzzle out the general meaning in context, not all of the terms, but yeah, I think I mean more experienced editors thought that it might be, of course, I'm more familiar with it, so it might be easier for me to puzzle out the meanings than a reader who's not, who doesn't read any French at all. So so the Anglophone reader's experience of the Creole is going to be different from our French readers, a non-Creolophone French reader's experience of the Creole, because there's some resonance, there's some things you can piece together and others that you can't. So, and Conde herself was kind of agnostic about it. She says, well, if you know, she's not completely anti-glossary, so I thought it was okay to go with it.
It was surprising because it was like with the Creolist movement, that sense of unaccommodating, and I thought that was that was a good way of walking the line, because this is my first thing I've ever read from Conde. Just toss of the coin, and the first chapter. I was like, what are these words? And, like, I was like so scared I was missing something. And I Googled it once or twice. And then I remember I just looked in the bag and I was like, oh, it's there in the glossary. But also I felt there's meaning in being confused in what those words mean too. As a reader, you know, there's a little bit of a journey there. So.
No, I think that's I love hearing your reactions, and then, having a glossary at the back. I mean, it gives you the option of, you know, it makes you sit with it for a little bit, and then you have a resource that you can turn to, but you have to actively flip to it too. So you're actively engaging with that text.
Earning it, imploring it, right? Literally. Cool. We have one more student question in, and then we'll move on to rolling out. Do you have it? Who's the next one?
The next one, Maria, she asks, what is your favorite Maryse Conde literary piece?
That's a really hard question. I think about this question sometimes. I think sometimes it depends on the day. Well, I mean, I'm so close to the Belle Creole that that one has always fascinated me. But I think I would probably say either Crossing the Mangrove, which was one of the first books that I read. I think it's because it's one of the first, and it's also so well crafted. That one, I'm really fond of that one. But I also really love Conde's memoirs, which in English they're called Tales from the Heart. It's a very different kind of piece from her novels, and I highly recommend that. So they're autobiographical tales from her childhood that are really infused with melancholy and sadness and yearning. So and they're also very tightly crafted too. So it's hard to pick between those two, but I would say right now, at this moment in time, this is what my answer would be.
Of course, that is very understandable. It's so hard to choose whenever you love someone so much. All right. Well, we kind of just have one more final question for you, and it's, are you currently working on anything to be released?
Oh, I'm working on a new research project. The working title is Alchemies of Blood, and I'm looking at kind of the resurgence of biological racism, or kind of discourses around race as located in the body, and how Afro-diasporic writers have responded to that notion with kind of alternative ideas about the body and kinship and relation. So, but that's in progress, so it won't be out for a little while.
Well, we look forward to it.
Thank you.
That's it. Hey, no more questions. We dug through it all. Thank you so much, everybody. That was Doctor. Let me get it right. Hey, Dr. Nicole Simek. Help me with the pronunciation, because she told me, and I.
No, you got it. You got it. It's Simek. Yeah. Thanks so much. It was such an honor to be invited. I really enjoyed talking with you both.
Yeah, thank you. Again, like we said, this is the Belle Creole. This was her translated work of Miss Maryse Condé. And then we have this book straight from the library. It's her a bit of her criticism with her classmates at Princeton. Is that correct? When you were there getting your doctorate, Feasting on Words. And she also has another publication that is available here on electronic library with Sims Library. And we really implore you to check her out more. Check out Condé. I'm becoming an advocate myself. I will never be like Dr. Simek, but I'd have to learn French first, correct? Yes. But we want to shout out real quick. Thank you to Dr. Ziba Rashidian. She's the one who really exposed us to this. Dr. Hanson, the department head, Dr. Landrum with the Writing Center. And we want to thank Dr. Saporsky over there in the ceramics department hooking us up. That has a Creole vibe to it if I were to think what Louisiana would have. But anyway, thank y'all for joining us with the Iconocast. I'm Tyler. This is Kendall, Caleb on tech. And next Monday, we will be with Dr. Mariana Cuno, who is in the department for world and foreign language. She's an ethnobotanist. She had a Mayan medicine publication about 15 years ago. So we'll be digging into the ethnography of that next Monday. But that was Dr. Nicole Simek here on the Iconocast. And we look forward to seeing y'all next time. Be good.
Thank you.